But tonight's moot, I really wanted to focus on Druids and Druidry for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's an interesting topic in and of itself. And two, I think unless anybody's been involved with looking at this in a serious way, um, there's a lot of misconceptions or misconceptions about who they were and what they were doing. There's that wonderful quote from Spinal Tap, if you've seen that fun documentary where the opening of a song called Stonehenge, the singer goes, "This is about the Druids, and nobody knows who they were and what they were doing." And I think that's kind of like a fun thing. And if you read the blog article, you have seen that clip. So where I want to go with this as an introduction, and then as we know, we talk more as a group a bit later on and share some deeper insights. I want to talk about what ancient druids were, and I've got that in sort of in air quotes for reasons. Then some myths, some misconceptions. Um, I will talk a little about what druid teachings are or were, but you're going to have to filter that out from what I say. I want to talk about bards in particular, then druid revivalists and druidry today. And hopefully, those key headings will take us on this interesting trip around a topic I find particularly personally fascinating, and to certain aspects of particularly the bardic tradition, I feel I've got a strong connection, more of which later when we talk about it. So, to talk about the Druids, we need to talk about the Celts. And the Celts, or Celtoi, as they were known in ancient Greece, we know were a group of tribes that inhabited Western and Central Europe, including Britain and Ireland, for a number of years. Coming across this country around about the beginning, start of the Iron Age, and moving forward through the Iron Age until the Romans invaded Britain, basically, as far as we're concerned. The first recording of the word name Celts, or as Celtoi, is in ancient Greece around 500 BC. So they've been around a long time. And he was really writing in 500 BC about a group of people living in southern Gaul, um, which is kind of interesting because we talk about the Celts as being British. Well, kind of. We'll talk about that in 1 minute. This is a lovely map I found. Um, the map there actually shows the heartland of the Celt, what's called the Celts territory, and how they spread out. They're a nomadic group of people. They really did travel a lot, and they covered a lot of ground, and they brought with them a series of their own culture, but tended to mix it also with local cultures. So not all the Druid, not sorry, the Celts had the same culture, although we tend to look at their art and their wonderful jewelry designs as being an indicator of the Celtic peoples. Um, no ethnic group really called itself the Celts until around about 1700, although we know that the word itself has a particular history. And the Celtic nations, of course, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, Brittany, and the Isle of Man are the ones we recognise today. And they're the ones that, certainly in Cornwall and, actually Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, well, there's a strong interconnection between, even today, of sharing their art and sharing their poems and stories. More about that in a later date. We know they're nomadic and they know they're a tribal culture structure. They weren't a singular group of people, which is the thing to remember. They were tribes, and each tribe had its own customs and cultures, microcultures within them, but they shared this common particular trait of beautiful ironwork and jewelry and stuff. So the Celtic society was structured around tribes, each tribe had its own king or chief, and in some cases queen or chief. They were skilled artisans renowned for their metalworkings. There's some beautiful examples of their talks and their workings on the picture there. They're particularly good at iron, and they made elaborate jewelry with intricate designs, usually spirals and twists. what was interesting is, for the time particularly, that Celtic women seem to have enjoyed more rights within the Celtic society than other societies, and they had the right to own land and choose their husbands, which was kind of not widely known or appreciated by other cultures of the time. They had a polytheistic religion, so we believe, with many gods and goddesses, and they believed in an afterlife of sorts. We'll talk about that later. And the Druids were technically their priests, teachers, judges, and they held a position of great respect within each of the tribes. Now, just reflecting upon these wonderful artifacts that they produced, a number of years ago, the British Museum were doing a tour of, they hosted a collection of major finds from the Celtic world. And within these was something called the Gunstrup Cauldron, which was found in a peat bog in a place called Gunstrup, believe it or not, in Northern Europe. And when they cleaned it up, this was a cauldron made of lots of plates, and the carvings on the plates had some very intricate figures of what presumably were gods and goddesses. Beautiful structure. This thing, quite awe-inspiring when you saw it. One set of ideas was the whole thing was a pack flat cauldron that they'd move from place to place. Don't know if that's true or not, but that's what it was presented as. Beautiful, beautiful designs, beautiful, beautiful graphics and artwork. Clearly, this was a culture that had the time and the resources and the skill to produce these wonderful works of art. Now, if a culture's got time and skill to develop these artistic talents, then they must be relatively settled. And that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. So whilst the Celtic group of peoples were moving across Europe, some groups were very well settled for fairly long periods of time. Now, this talk is called The Druids, and just to start off for a moment is that I think if you mention Druid to many people who at least thought about it a bit, they will immediately say something along the lines of the Druids were obviously the priests or the religious leaders. Some may understand the Druids as being a group of teachers and scholars who were involved in educating the people in the tribe. Some may even suggest they were judges and lawmakers. That is, the Druids responsible for setting the laws within the community. They certainly were advisors, and the thing that I like particularly is it seems very likely they were sort of holders of knowledge, particularly tribal knowledge, but also cultural history. Because one of the things that's really interesting about the Celtic peoples, despite their wonderful artwork, they didn't write down much of the stuff. In fact, there are very few, if any, writings from the early Celtic periods from Celtic peoples. That's worth bearing in mind. So the evidence that these things called Druids existed and the Celtic tribes existed come from people like Julius Caesar, who was writing commentaries on the places that Romans controlled and conquered. Other Roman writers like Cicero, Tacitus, Pliny the Elder, who you may have heard from at school, also mentioned the Druids and the Celts. And as I say, there are few, if any, written records by the Druids themselves. It was largely an oral tradition, which is why there was a lot of sort of importance placed upon either the bards or the Druids that were the keepers of this wisdom and tradition. I find that quite a fascinating idea, because one of the reasons we know cultures existed was that they'd leave us behind their artifacts. In recent times, and I'm talking about historically recent times, they also wrote a lot. And they produced books and they produced paper evidence or papyrus evidence, like the Egyptians were writing in papyri. So that written evidence, that documentary evidence, tells us a lot about the culture, but there's very little, if anything, from the Celtic nations that we want to talk about. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, how much of what we read from historical sources is actually propaganda? The Romans were trying to conquer various outposts that were actually controlled by Celtic tribes. And so anything the Romans wrote needs to be considered in the context of they were the aggressors or they were the imperial armies, and they had a particular attitude to the native peoples. Roman writers stated the Druids offered human sacrifices for those who were gravely sick or in danger of death in battle. That's kind of interesting. Did they sacrifice the gravely sick for those in danger of death on battle? I don't know. But the Druids wrote about this. If you've seen the film The Wicker Man, which I think the older version is much, much superior to the newer Nicolas Cage version. But there are images of these living men that were filled with people and the Druids sacrificing them and to whatever gods they chose. It's a pretty violent image. And we're talking about, shall we say, the aggressors writing about the defenders. What I find interesting is that it may well be that this was ancient Druid practice, but then sacrifice, human and animal, was common for that time. Caesar was said to be one of the chief authorities about the Druids, and of course Julius Caesar was running an empire and trying to quell the people in the empire, so maybe his view wasn't exactly neutral. Some of the facts from Julius Caesar quotes are from a Stoic philosopher called Poseidonus, and what was interesting about Poseidonus is that he did look into some of the stories, the medieval Irish sagas or the pre-medieval sagas, to try and see what was going on. Caesar's described that there was an annual assembly of Druids to elect an archdruid, and that's also confirmed by Irish sagas. Now, we're talking here about stories that were written several hundred years after the stories about the action the stories were about. I'll talk about that in a moment. One of the personally moving things I will share with you is the Romans were in Britain were trying to protect and expand their territories. There were numerous Celtic tribes across Britain, many of whom were trying to defend their culture and their heritage, a number of whom worked alongside the Roman army, trying to have a sort of negotiated settlement, if you like. What I find really interesting is that a lot of Roman sort of places that were special, take, for example, the Roman baths. In Bath, would you be surprised at? Actually, the structures there had both the Roman gods that the baths were dedicated to, and the Celtic god Sulis Minerva, who were dealt to. So they kept both traditions alive. So at times, these traditions would have lived together. And that's how religions spread, by the way. That's called syncretism, where they share ideas. But some of the Celtic tribes in Britain in particular wouldn't play ball. And so they started to rebel against the Roman imperial forces. Now, What we are aware of from writings is that there were a number of places which were seen as, shall we say, Druid special places. Yeah. And these special places were where it is likely that they had these regular meetings. They were strongholds of the Celtic faith traditions. One of those places was Anglesey, which, if you've never been to Anglesey, it's well worth a trip. And I'm sure somebody who's listening to this right now can add so much more to this a bit later on. But Anglesey is a rather interesting place because during one of the uprisings during 660 AD, the Roman official in the area, Paulinus, decided to attack Anglesey because those pesky Druids were stirring up the locals and telling them to rebel. That was the story. And Anglesey was attacked. Paulinus had a bit of a problem because Anglesey, right the way over in sort of tip of North Wales, the island of North Wales, and at the same time, Boudica, who I'm sure you've heard of, her little tribe of Druids, Celts, were having a revolt on the eastern part of England. So Paulinus had to separate his attacks in order to quell both of those uprisings. Boudica met a very unfortunate end, which we can talk about if you want to later. But the Isle of Anglesey, where there were several groves, supposedly of sacred places to the Druids, to the Celtic people, they were just ransacked. They were destroyed. The priesthood were killed. The Druids were killed. People were sacrificed, murdered. Let's call it that, by the Roman armies. And there's a wonderful story, again from Pliny the Elder, I think it was, who describes the Roman soldiers on the banks of the Menai Straits on the mainland, looking across to the the shores of the island of Anglesey, and the two opposing forces were facing each other. The Roman soldiery, the legions with their efficient war machine, faced these, shall we say, ramshackle group of fierce men, women, and Celtic warriors. And the soldiers initially were petrified by these druids that were chanting across the waves at them, and these women, the druidesses, were running backwards and forwards, screaming and conjurations. And actually, the soldiers didn't want to cross, and they were forced to cross by their leaders under pain of greater death. But Menai is one of those places where this, I'm going to call it genocide, right, happened. And if you go to Anglesey now, it's quite an interesting place. I know that one of our groups may talk a bit about that later. The personal connection with that for me is when I did get to Anglesey, well, a number of years ago now. There, when you go to a place and you feel like a connection with the land, well, that was one of the places I really did feel connected to. Now, the psychologist in me says, was that because of the stories? But the mystic in me says, no, it's because of something else. So there we go. Now, there is a history and mystery, and we're just, you'll know these, I'm sure you will, but the number of times when I was in school, when I was younger, and being shown images of druids, wherever they got the images from, and they were always pictured against Stonehenge, or some other kinds of Neolithic monuments. And the kind of assumption is that Druids built Stonehenge. No, they didn't. No, they didn't. There's a group of people well before them, but it is very likely that the Druids identified these places as sacred and used them, as for their own ends. I can accept that. But the Druids and Stonehenge are separated by quite a long time in history. The other thing is that Merlin, the character we've all grown up with, because we're steeped in Arthurian myth and legend, aren't we? That Merlin was a Druid. Well, no, was there a Merlin? Although there is quite a lot of evidence to suggest there really was a Merlin, possibly related to northern Wales, which in the times they're writing about, northern Wales included Strathclyde, much to the annoyance of the Scottish. That Merlin was a Druid. Well, no, Merlin is more fictional, or at least romanticized fiction, and Druids are Druids. However, you can't escape this idea that in romantic fiction, Merlin was painted as a kind of Druid in the sense of he was ascribed certain characteristics that people who were said to be Druids had. The idea that there was a magic afoot, that they could actually foretell the future, that they were powerful teachers, as in Merlin and the Arthur stories. Another history of mystery, mistletoe and oak was sacred to the Druids. Well, that is true. Yeah, they were. Groves of oak were probably possible, certainly in the southern parts of this of England. Mistletoe was a plant that seemed to grow on a tree but without any roots, so it was grown of the air. There's all kinds of suggested symbolism between the idea that mistletoe representing fertility and the oak's solidity. But so mistletoe and oak were sacred. We have these wonderful stories later on in history of the Druids having a golden sickle, and they would gather their mistletoe with a golden sickle after climbing up a tree, and the mistletoe would be caught in a cloth as it fell from the tree, so it wouldn't touch the ground, because mistletoe was a symbol of air, probably. And this wonderful stuff. And then I started to think about the practicality of using a golden sickle to cut anything. But the story is quite nice. There's an unbroken chain of Druidry teachings between then and now. I love to believe that was true, but it isn't. It isn't. The Druidry I have now, I believe, is a reconstituted, reconstructed, recreated in some cases, tradition. That doesn't invalidate it, as we'll talk about later, but what it does do is it puts into perspective. When somebody says to me that something is traditional, I can accept that even if they only started doing it yesterday, because a tradition needs to start somewhere. But if somebody says to me traditional and wants to claim historical authenticity, I'm doing this now because 20,000 years ago somebody else did it and believed it. I have a problem with that. And within the New Age movement, as many of you have heard me talk about before, there is a lot of fantastical connections between things that are lovely to think about, but very unlikely to be genuine connections. They're modern traditions. And as I say, nothing wrong with that. A tradition can start whenever you want it to be, but at least be honest about where that tradition comes from. And we'll see that story of traditions repeated in a moment. And then Druids gathered in woodland groves. Well, that's the big thinking. Druids and the word oak connect together, and it seems to be likely that they connected in these woodland groves, because Druids, as far as we can work out, and the Celtic peoples, as far as we can understand, were actually connected to nature. They had to be. We, as sort of modern people, are not really connected to nature. Okay, we can, as we were joking earlier about the fact it's been a hot day today, I need to stay in the cool. But go back to when these people were around, if it was a hot day, you had to find somewhere cool. We didn't try to control nature in the way that we can now with air conditioning and heating and buildings. I do I have a wry smile occasionally when I see that people talking about global warming and all these wonderful ways that nature is fighting back. It kind of puts a perspective on it of everything, but that's a different kind of story. So, what do we really know? As I say, very little. What we do know seems to follow this pattern. There was a tradition of bards, people who would be the storytellers, the poets, the musicians, the people that would transmit oral history and mythology of their culture through the spoken word. Um, the bards were many and numerous, and it would be highly likely that every chieftain would have their bard. And the bard's job would be to comment on the successes and failings of their leader, and they could probably get away with just more than a little bit of sort of satire within their commentaries of their leaders. They would probably be advisors because they would actually have the oral history of their peoples. And in some traditions, bards were believed to possess magical powers and they could influence events and even predict the future. Now, just a little aside here, and we'll come on to it a bit more detail later, but if bards were storytellers and bards had access to an oral tradition, then I can totally get how magic and divination are linked to the possession or the understanding of story. More about that in a moment. So the bards we know existed, and there were some very famous bards. Then we have this group of people that were called vates, or in modern term, ovates. The Greek writer Strabo described the vates as interpreters of nature. And the vates, again, attested to by their enemies, but the vates were the people that were skilled in divination and understood the natural world. And they were the seers, interpreters, and they found signs in animal sacrifices and bird-like patterns and all kinds of stuff. In some ways, the vates or the ovates developed a skill in observing nature to tell you things, rather like the fisherman that sits down on the local harbour and tells you what the weather's going to be the next day, not because he's read the BBC News, but because they've watched the sky and they've watched the sea. And often these people are far more accurate over a 24-hour period for their period than some of our weather forecasts, because they've lived the nature cycles. And then the other group of people were the Druids, which were really the advisors and the priests and teachers and the keepers of the law. It is suggested that the Druids' colleges were places where there was much learned debate and much science was going on and much connecting of ideas was going on. And from this idea of the Druids being this learned class, we have the idea that maybe they started out as bards, became ovates, and moved into Druidry. They started out with knowing the culture and the stories. They moved into the divination and working with nature, and they moved into becoming a Druid, which was the teacher, the council, and all that kind of stuff. And at least one modern Druid order follows that traditional pattern. I remember reading a book a few years ago, well, not several books, but one of the books a few years ago was suggested that you could progress through these grades in cycles of 7 years. 7 years as a bard, 7 years as an ovate, 7 years as a druid. That may or may not be based upon some kind of reality, I don't know, but again, 7 and 21 are quite important numbers and interesting numbers if people are into numerology and magical use of numbers. So I love this graphic. It's from a website called the Druids Garden. Go and have a look at it if you like. It's the Ancient Order of Druids of America. More about that later. But I love this drawing because this tries to show you that Druidry can be broken into these three branches, if you like. The bard who's into the stories and the poetry and the creative arts and the history, the ovate that's interested in nature and living with nature and all of that comes, and then the druid, for want more than a sorry, for want of a better phrase term, would be the philosopher teacher, the person who led the ceremonies and ordered and managed the structure of things. And that three branches of Druidry as an idea has existed and still exists within some Druid schools, but we can't be sure that that is a fair assumption of how Druids practiced back then. There was nothing in my mind stopping a bard being a druid and a druid being an ovate and an ovate being a bard. One of the ways I used to explain it to the people I was working with on Druidry from my perspective was maybe you started out as a bard understanding the stories and your history. You moved into the working with nature bit as an ovate. You became a druid, but then you go back as a bard and you go round and round again. So it was a cyclical a spiral curriculum rather than 7 years in each discipline. Because actually, the more you understand your history, the more you can understand what forces that may produce your future. And the more you can understand that, the more you can maybe take a philosophical view on things. And that can actually lead you to deeper stories and so on and so forth. Now, I'm just going to mention two people that, if you've not come across, are well worth looking up. American white knees. Now that sounds like a Native American, really, doesn't it? But it isn't. Now there is. Emergin probably wasn't a real person, right? Unfortunately, Emergin may be a synthesis of lots of different ideas from the Bardic tradition. But for those of you who just need a bit of a catch up here, in Irish mythology, Ireland was first settled by a race of people called the Fomorians. And they were kind of wild and they were kind of, a bit nutty. And then it was taken over by a group of people collectively known as the Tuatha De Danann. And the Tuatha De Danann were people from various compass points from around Ireland who gathered on Ireland and they ruled Ireland for a while. The Tuatha De Danann were really what we became the pantheon of Celtic gods or Irish Celtic gods and goddesses. So this is a mythstory of how Ireland was populated. The Tuatha De Danann ruled Ireland, but of course they were godlike, they were supernatural characters, and so the Milesian folk, who were human folk, wanted to come in and actually have their claim on Ireland. And Emergin was asked to be an impartial judge for parties settling the rules of engagement. Now, I find this really fascinating that these two parties were going to have a huge battle. One was equipped with supernatural powers, and the other group were actually probably just hardened warriors with their belief. And Emergin was acting as what are the rules for this battle that's going to come. And so what happened was the Milesians agreed to leave the island and retreat a short distance beyond the ninth wave, which was a magical boundary. And again, some of this may sound familiar to you, the beyond the ninth wave magical boundary. And the idea was that they would group their forces beyond the ninth wave and then they would attack. However, the Tuatha De Danann were a bit sneaky, really. They raised a magical storm which kind of stopped the Milesians moving forward. And Emergin was called and asked to sing a song or recite a poem, bringing the Milesian ships to land, and the battle happened, and the Milesians won the day, and the Tuatha De Danann were driven to the underworld, where they became the fairy folk. I know that's terribly abridged, but you get the idea. This is what we believe the Song of Emergin was, and I want to point something out here. This is a translation of an oral tradition of what this story was and what this song was. And I think it interesting that this is a poet summoning up the forces of nature. And notice all the statements are I am. I am the wind on the sea. I am the wave of the sea. I am the stag of 7 battles. I am the eagle on the rock. I am a flash from the sun. I am the most beautiful of plants. I am a strong wild boar. I am a salmon in the water. I am a lake in the plain. I am the word of knowledge. I am the head of a spear in battle. I am the god that puts fire in the head. Who spreads light in the gathering upon the hills? Who can tell the ages of the moon? Who can tell the place where the sun rests? I love that. It's beautiful. And within it, those of you that want to explore this, there are several references to other stories, particularly to do with salmons and boars and knowledge. But here, this is a spell. The Song of Mergin was reciting this spell in order to quell the storm. The command, I am the wind on the sea, I am the wave on the sea, is actually telling nature, I have authority over you. I am going to get you to calm down so we can get our troops on the land. Whether a Mergin was an individual or whether it was a collection of people that have been syncretized into one character, or whether the writings of this person have been, shall we say, altered from going from the oral tradition to the written tradition, I still think this is rather beautiful. And that statement of I am. Think about the power of that as a statement that we can make, about ourselves. I am, whatever. I am the kind person the wind asks me to be. I am you get the idea. The idea of spelling, casting a spell, for me is to do with words. Spells are words. And so when we craft something beautiful that's poetical, it can contain the energy because we're spelling out the intention. Won't go into too much more detail here, but I'll leave you with that. And please look this person up, look the history up. And then you get caught up into Irish mythology and all about the settling of Ireland and the tribes of Ireland, which is amazing because if you've stood on some of these places where these meetings and these people were said to talk, there is a vibe there. So the Welsh person in me, wants to just mention another bard, called Taliesin, means shining brow in Welsh. Now, he was Taliesin now is likely to be more of a historical character than a Merging. But he was a poet in sub-Roman Britain, and his writings survived in Middle Welsh books, manuscripts, one being the Book of Taliesin. They're a collection of poems. We have to bear in mind that these were oral tradition, eventually written down by somebody who may well have had a different understanding of the words and certainly a different political agenda, but it's interesting nevertheless. But Taliesin was a bard. He has a fantastic origin story. The origin story is that as a baby, he was thrown into the river wrapped in a leather sack and washed down and found by a rather unfortunate Welsh leader who, on discovering the sack, opened it and the baby started to recite poetry and enchant the leader, who then went on to do great things. Isn't that the Moses story, by the way? I'll leave you thinking about that one. But this is a wonderful poem. Again, I'll put the word talisman there. Sorry, that's a spell correction. Taliesin, it should say. So this is called The Battle of the Trees. And again, notice, I'm not going to read this, notice that I have been a multitude of shapes. I will believe when it is apparent. I have been a tear in the air. I've been the dullest of stars. I've been a word amongst letters. I've been a book in the origin. I've been the light of lanterns. That I am statement over and over again. It's beautiful. Now, the poem relates to a translation of an oral tradition from the Book of Taliesin, and it's about a story about a legendary encounter where Gwydion, an enchanter, if you like, animates the trees to fight to the forest to fight as his army, and it's beautiful symbolism. But notice, where have we come across trees being encouraged to fight as an army? If you've read your Tolkien and you know about Lord of the Rings, you would have come across that. Tolkien was a scholar. He was schooled. He was interested in these Celtic or these older myths, and in fact, a lot of these ancient myths still filter through our current awareness because they exist as archetypes for future stories. So it's not talisman; it's Taliesin, and it's the Battle of the Trees. So a few more people to mention before we hand over to discussion. This is a character I kind of love, Iolo Morganwg. His real name was Edward Williams, but he looks like a bit of a miserable so-and-so there on the right. I couldn't find a flattering picture of him actually, and most of the drawings are of this kind of, I don't know, weird-looking dude that wouldn't sort of look out of place in an Edgar Allan Poe story. But Edward Williams, was an expert. He genuinely was, and collector of medieval Welsh literature. So he collected a lot of the stories and the poems that we've kind of been talking about, the Taliesin stuff particularly. And within the Welsh tradition, there are lots of things called triads, and these triads are comparative statements. I won't bore you with them now, but it is suggested that Edward created or forged several manuscripts in his collection, which is rather unfortunate because a lot of his writings influenced the rebirth of Druidry. Yeah. It really, if you read Morganwg's stuff, he took the name Iolo Morganwg as a bardic name to separate out his mundane life from, shall we say, his Druid aspirational life. And he really started to, in writing, conflate the supposed Druidic histories through the bardic poems with Christianity and probably a touch of Arthurian myth to create this tradition. And this was at a time, bear in mind, sort of the 17 to 1800s, where there was beginning to be an upswell of interests in people calling back their heritage. So Iolo was riding this wave of interest in the past, and in particular, the distant past, where things may have been more magical, more spiritual, whatever. And there was a body of genuine poetry and genuine works which he was influenced by, and he created other works which initially he ascribed to being translations of much older texts, but were probably his creations. And this is where that idea of tradition comes in, right? He was referring to historical tradition, but he was creating or recreating or redesigning or forging, depending on your terms, a newer tradition which inspired lots of things that came afterwards. I find him a fascinating character. I find it interesting that a number of years ago, I saw a news article about tourism in Wales where Iolo Morganwg is actually being hailed as not being a forger, but being as quite a creative dude and an influential dude. And I think he was an influential dude. But he's an important person to know in our story of Drudry, because now we've moved from the ancient Druids and some of the ancient sources, some of the Celtic sources, into this middle ground of where the Druids kind of weren't really mentioned too much, into the 1700s when Druidry became more and more fascinating. In fact, the Romantic period and discovery of the Arthurian myth and some of the stuff that was circulated then ties in with this. And later on, into the 18th and early 1900s, we saw this real interest in different forms of spirituality, which we can talk about another time. So Iolo Morganweg was quite an interesting character and wrote a tremendous amount of stuff. A lot of his stuff is well worth your reading, but you will see some of the joins, and you will suddenly see that's a very Christian influence. And there's nothing wrong with that, by the way, but you will see where traditions have merged. Now, we're coming right up to what may be considered modern bardism, if not Druidry, a Gorseth. Now, the word Gorseth means throne in Welsh, but we know there's a Cornish Gorseth and we know there's a Breton Gorseth. And these were said to be in the past, but are now annual biannual meetings of bards of the communities who sit down and they compete in songwriting, singing, poetry, artistic endeavors, research, and they celebrate their Celtic tradition. The folk band that I was in, the fiddle player, my good friend, he was a Cornish bard. And so I was on the fringes of that movement. And of course, we were playing music that was inspired by Cornish tradition. He spoke fluent Cornish. I can't speak Cornish. But this Gorsedd tradition is really, really, really a vibrant thing in Celtic nations. It is suggested that there's records of a Gorsedd as an institution 1,000 years before the Christian era. It is said, I'm not sure we can backtrack that, but it's written, and the Welsh Gorsedd talks about that tradition. We probably know the Gorsedds in Welsh as the Eisteddfod. It's the same kind of thing. So we know that there were Eisteddfods in Wales around about 540, and they were given under an organisation. And then in 1792, Edward Williams, Iolo Morganwg, actually restarted the Gorsedd, the Welsh Gorsedd, with more traditional roots, where it was celebrating the arts, the poetry, the stories of the Welsh tradition in 1792. In 1928, inspired by the growth of the Welsh Gorsedd, the Cornish Cerno, or Gorsedd Cerno, was set up. And the first one of those was held at Boscawen, beautiful stone circle down in Penwith. And it was about the Cornish language revival. And it is interesting that that Gorsedd still continues, has grown. And Boscawen is another special place, but we'll talk about that later. I have come across several references to Boscawen being an equivalent Druid meeting point to some of the places on Anglesey, which is why Henry Jenner used Boscawen as one of the places for the Cornish Gorsedd. But can't prove that, just an interesting idea. So this celebration of art, this society that is willing to create beautiful jewelry and artisans and have oral tradition of storytelling, of music, of poetry, is beautiful, I think. but they must have been a tough group of people, and the Druids will have been seen to be the people doing this organizational aspect of things and bringing ceremony and ritual to the place. This is an interesting one. There is, within modern Freemasonry, and I don't know too much about it because I'm not a Freemason, although I've got friends that are Freemasons, but there are, there's a Druid order within Freemasonry. And where this kind of comes from, back in 1781, the Ancient Order of Druids, AOD, was established in London. And the people that were part of the Ancient Order of Druids were trying to recreate some of the stuff they've been reading from people like Eolo and the historical stuff. And they wanted a society that reflected what they believed Druid orders to be, albeit a Christian order. That was succeeded in 1874 by the Ancient and Archaeological Order of Druids, in 1874, and this was set up as an attempt to take the fluff out of the Ancient Order of Druids and go back to the archaeological evidence for the Order of Druids. Now, Robert Wentworth, little who set it up, was a Freemason, and he also founded the Rosicrucians in Anglia. So, like many Masons of his time, he believed that Freemasonry inherited symbols of much more ancient pagan traditions, and that influenced his desire to create an ancient Druid order. Interesting, they flourished, whereas the Ancient Order of Druids carried on. The Ancient Archaeological Order of Druids continued, and people didn't have to be Masons to be a part of this initially. So their system ran parallel to the Freemasonry system, and it was meant to be ancient Celtic Druidry, which I find really interesting. However, at that time, 1700s, 1800s, there were other societies growing up that were offering something slightly different. They were offering ritual, they were offering brotherhood, fraternity, but they were also offering benefit groups. They were also offering sort of support for the less wealthy of their community. So the Oddfellows, the Shepherd's Friendly Society, and the Foresters particularly set up. Oddfellows know something more about, still running, a very wealthy society, but gives back a heck of a lot to its members as a friendly society. So 1730, a lot of the members of those two Druid groups, particularly the Archaeological Ancient Order of Druids, were more attracted to the benefits they could get if they fell sick or were injured or whatever, that Oddfellows in particular, but Foresters and Shepherds were also offering. So many defected from these Druidic roots. And by 1886, membership within the Ancient and Archaeological Order of Drudry started to fall, and by then the governing Grand Grove decided that they would change its name to the Ancient Masonic Order of Druids and expel all the members who were not Master Masons in good standing. And so that closed down the way that people could get access to a so-called Druid group formally, which I find very interesting. And it's a spin on this story that I've only recently started to think about. Along comes this great guy called Ross Nichols. He was a poet, artist, historian, and an academic. He was really interested in Druidry, but not in the Masonic form of Druidry, in whatever form it could become. Now, you need to bear in mind that the forms of Druidry going before Ross Nichols, before what he developed, were of interest to people of certain classes, and they did have annual meetings at Stonehenge. Winston Churchill was a Druid, um, which is interesting. And so many well-known people of the day were involved in either Freemasonry or one of the Druid offspins. Yeah. Ross Nichols was looking at something a bit different. And in 1964, he established the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, or OBOD to its friends. Now, where the influences came from this is really, I think, quite interesting and subject to great debate. But he was obviously an authority. He was obviously interested in bringing something back in a different form. And in 1954, Nichols was asked to edit Gerald Gardner's Witchcraft Today. Now, Witchcraft Today is it's an incredible look at how the modern idea of witchcraft or Wicca works, the Gerald Gardner's version. And Ross Nichols was asked to edit this. And he worked on not only the book on Wicca, but on what he started to believe Druidry could be. And he borrowed some of Gerald Gardner's stuff, and he borrowed liberally from people like Iolo and much older traditions to create a curriculum where it would honor Celtic mythology and the storytelling of old, and it would celebrate the 8 seasonal ceremonies and arrange the teachings of the order into 3 grades: the bards, the ovates, and the druids. And if you're interested in this stuff, you can find the bards Obod online. You can join their groups, and you can then take part in their training sessions should you wish. Many of which are sort of mailed to you, and then you could attend their summer camps and goodness knows what. The OBOD syllabus, the OBOD practice, is fantastic. Okay, if you've not come across any of the bardic Celtic source material in terms of stories, it's well worth a look. And it will actually get you into that idea of the bardic tradition. So Ross Nichols, an important character. His Book of Druidry is a must-read if you're interested in this. You have to bear in mind that although in places it looks like he's talking with, this is what the ancients did, and this is what the old Druids did, he's not really referring to that. It's about an evolving tradition with nature being at the centre. And hence it's modern Druidry. There is a wonderful story that I would like to think is true, but probably isn't. So it's one of those kind of stories that you take with a pinch of salt. One of the names in modern occultism that I think everybody has heard, a few people are more familiar with, and fewer people have studied, is a guy called Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley was well versed in all kinds of stuff. He himself was a Mason. He himself tinkered with Eastern mysticism. He himself worked with the Rosy Cross, Rosicrucian order. He was also in an organization called the Golden Dawn, which was technically an adaptation of Freemasonry. Gerald Gardner certainly was in Rosicrucianism and in Freemasonry and wanted to have a more down-to-earth kind of approach to magic. And of course, Ross Nichols would have been writing all of his stuff. Now, the story that I heard, and I love it as a wonderful anecdote, is that early on in their explorations, Ross Nichols and Gerald Gardner were sitting having a cup of tea with the older Aleister Crowley, who was talking to them about the importance of earth-based magical traditions, because a lot of the esoteric magical traditions had lost some of that earth connection. And the story goes that he set Gerald Gardner off to develop what became Wicca, and he set Ross Nichols off to develop what became Druidry, to see who would actually win a contest of attracting more people to their tradition. Now, I know that's probably doing a great disservice to both Gardner and Nichols, but I think it's an interesting story, because when you study this stuff, especially Wicca, you cannot help but not notice the influence of the Golden Dawn. It's less obvious within Druidry, however, which I find refreshing. So Druidry is technically today based around 8 seasonal festivals, which is the same as modern Wicca, these seasonal festivals. But there's no complete evidence that the ancient Druids ever celebrated all these festivals. There's some evidence they did celebrate Samhain and Samhain, Imbolg, and probably Beltane. I should have added that there. Samhain and Beltane at the opposite ends of the year. If you're really interested in this, then you a must read. His name has just escaped me. It'll come back to me in a moment. It's I'll come back later. But the 8 seasonal festivals are really a journey through nature. It's a framework for the disconnected. I think most of us are disconnected from nature, and it's an excuse for a get together. So these festivals that now exist within both Druid and Wiccan calendars are a way of seeing nature's journey. I remember when I first started doing the OBOD stuff, I think it was, where one of the things was to draw out our own Wheel of the Year. And in it, you write in what happens in each of the 13 lunar months. So dividing a circle into 13 is great fun. But you write it in like a journal, an ongoing journal for a year. And later on, I was comparing my little observational things that were going on in nature with other people's. And of course, they're going to be different, aren't they? Depending on what part of the country you're on. Ronald Hutton, that's the word. Look up Ronald Hutton, Professor Ronald Hutton, for any of his work on Druidry in particular, but also Wicca, a must read. Okay, sorry, got that. So back to plotting out the Wheel of the Year. One of the things that drawing that circle did, and following it round season by season, or shall we say lunar month by lunar month, is you become acutely aware of what's going on underneath you and around you, which I think is the closest we can get to ancient Druidry, in the sense that they would have been acutely aware of what's going on around them. It's an exercise I would recommend any of you do, because it really is a connecting exercise. And if you're going to start this kind of journey, well worth doing. Now, in Drudry, there's a lot of talk about other worlds, the unknown point of existence, the Abred, the Cogent, and the Grid. My Welsh is not very good. These 4 circles, these appear in Iolo's work, and they don't exist, as far as we can tell, within older or more traditional sources. So either Iolo invented, recreated, or reconstructed this system. However, the idea of having these 4 realms through which we experience life is quite an interesting idea. The other world, this realm of magic and enchantment and mystery, than the realm of experience where we learn, the place where we got potential of becoming something else, and then the realm of purity, perfection. This is very Christian influenced. And this obviously is the product of YOLO, not of Celtic Druidry, old-fashioned Druidry. But just because something's new doesn't mean it's a tradition that you can start to follow. I think it's lovely to look at. But we know from Celtic stories, bardic stories, that there was a discussion of the other world, the worlds where people could commune with magical beings. This idea that sitting and going to sleep on a fairy mound in Ireland, you travel to the realm of the fairies. And the fairies weren't these things with little wings that fluttered and flapped. These are scary things because they were the beings of the Tuatha De Danann. We have this idea that underneath the ground in Cornwall, there is a realm where the knockers and the pixies dwell. This idea of other magical spaces and this idea of in-between worlds, which is a very strong idea within Druid mythology. The idea that where you're standing on the land and standing by the water, you're at the threshold. Was what's called a liminal space, where you can be firmly footed or you can be drowning. That space, right, where you're on the edge of something, is a fascinating space to explore in a mystical sense. Funny story here. You may have seen the television program Mystic Britain, I think it is. Clive Anderson, I think it is the guy. Well, a number of years ago, I got a phone call from the production team for that, and I was asked to go and would I be willing to talk about the Lady of the Lake and the sword? Would I be able to go and talk about that? I said, yeah. So I got asked. I got met the production team, which is a very small team. They just come around in one van with 3 or 4 sort of technical people and Clive Anderson there, who actually is a lovely guy. And they asked me where we could film this because Mystic Britain was a mix of trying to sort out mythical locations and give them a bit of historical or magical background. So one of the places where Excalibur was supposed to have been thrown in the Lady of the Lake legends and the Arthur legends is Dosemary Pool in Bodmin Moor. So we suggested Dosemary Pool. So I met them all there and was talking to Clive Anderson. He was a lovely guy, and there's a lot. I don't know if you've done this stuff, but when you do something on television, there's a lot of faffing around. So I was just sitting next to the lake with him, talking about all kinds of stuff, and he kind of realised that I wasn't as much of a loon as he was expecting to meet, I think. But what was fascinating was I had a sword, and I talked about the idea of the sword being thrown into the lake and the idea that it being a liminal space. And then I talked about the findings, the incredible findings, one of the lakes on the Isle of Anglesey, where weapons and shields and jewelry seem to have been given as offerings to the lake, to the bog actually, as it would have been at the time. And those finds you can see in the British Museum. But there seemed to be this thing of throwing things into water. So the Lady in the Lake story and the throwing Excalibur into the lake is not such a mad thing as you think it would be. And I, in my kind of cheeky way, I got him to appreciate the fact that you could throw this sword into the lake, but he wasn't going to. And then I talked about the in-between worlds, the liminal space. And then I talked about a chant that anybody in Obod or any other Druid order will know called the Awen chant, Awen. And the idea is that when you chant Awen as a long, slow, outward chant, it is like a mantra. And it's a meditation chant. So you've got to picture this, and I think it's on the television program that went out. I get Clive Anderson to stand at the edge of the lake, holding my sword in the air, and then slowly dipping into the water while chanting Awen. And I tell him that he has to walk into the water. So I've got walking into the water bring us too deep. He's a great sport, and it was a great bit of television, but it was a lot of fun. But there was a lot of seriousness there in the sense that in between worlds, doorways, these are magical things. I've gone off on a tangent a little bit, but sitting on the shoreline is a magical space where the land meets the sea. Sitting on a mountaintop where the sky meets the land are magical places, which brings us on to this idea. And it's an idea within modern Druidry that I think is really important. It's the idea of there being the land, the sea, and the sky. And these are the three realms that we live in and between. The land is obviously the place that we live. The sky is the realm of the celestial deities, if you like, and the sea is the underworld. And for me, this simple division into three worlds makes a lot of sense in terms of understanding Celtic stories and understanding stories that we create. I think this is worth thinking about. It is one of the reasons why I think places like stone circles on mountaintops or on plains were important. It's one of the reasons, or were seen as important. It's one of the reasons why the holy wells are important. It's one of these places where you can stand between the worlds. And I'll leave that at that for a moment. And there we go. So it's going to be over to you guys to talk about that. Oh no, I've got one more thing to say. Sorry. One more thing to say. Don't go away. There's a reason for this. A number of years ago, I was encouraged to read a book called Stranger in a Strange Land. I won't tell you why I was encouraged to read it, but it's by this really interesting author called Robert Heinlein, who was a big science fiction writer of his time. It's Stranger in a Strange Land is a direct quote from King James' first Bible, Exodus 2:22. The story Stranger in a Strange Land is, if you've not read it, it's worth reading. It's a very good story. It's about a future time where people are born on Mars, and the colonies on the Earth still exist, but there's a colony on Mars. And it's about one character who is born on Mars, and therefore Mars by this stage has its own culture, its own understandings of the way things are. And Mars is a fairly dry planet, so things like water are very important. And this person, for whatever reason, needs to come back to Earth, where he is surrounded by a completely alien culture. So although this hero character is part of the human race, he has been living, and his family have been living on Mars, maybe for a couple of generations, and he suddenly has to come back to Earth, and the cultures are conflicting. And the story explores how he, the character from Mars, either does or does not integrate properly within the cultures on Earth. And it raises all kinds of issues, like politics, sexuality, things that we're just accept without question. And in this, they use a phrase grok. So I grok you, for example. And grok is a really interesting word. It has kind of passed into the the English language a little bit. But grok was a profound understanding of somebody or something. It encompasses love, empathy, being one with something. So the idea of grokking, or I grok, a statement, I grok you, doesn't mean I love you, doesn't necessarily mean, it means I get you at every level. And there's some beautiful sequences in the book where the character is trying to grok people and not be fully understood. I won't spoil the ending, but they grok each other in a very different way towards the end. But there are lots of parallels between this idea of having to take something in order to completely understand it. And so grokking became an important idea in one of the Druid orders I've not really mentioned just yet, but I'm going to mention it now. A Druid order that I belong to is called the Reformed Druids of Gaia, and they use this book as a kind of interesting question book, and they make the, shall we say, the statement that we don't know what the Druids really did, but they're doing it the way the ancients did, making it up as you go along. And the idea is that by doing this, although there's a structure to it, we can finally grok and connect with the nature all around us. And I'll stop there